Whether you're looking for answers to specific life questions or just seeking to become the best version of you possible, welcome to the Mental Breakdown and Psych Reg podcast, where we offer insight, information, and strategies based upon research and years of practice as clinical psychologists. So sit back, have a listen, and get connected with our hosts, Dr. Bernie Wilkinson and Dr. Richard Marshall. Welcome back. On today's show, we're going to respond to another listener. We've got, over the last couple of weeks, we've gotten a lot of great questions from listeners. Right. And today's question has to do with the biological bases of mental health conditions. Now, we've talked about before that most mental health conditions have some biological root. Right. We know that there is a genetic component to most mental health conditions. And we know that a lot of times individuals with mental health conditions, there's some effect on the brain that causes some difficulties with executive functions, and it causes problems with memory retrieval and lots of other memory formation and lots of things.
There's something affecting the brain,
right?
Or there's
right.
Okay.
And so we know also from different kinds of studies that there are many mental health conditions that are very directly related to brain function, brain structure, neurochemistry. Schizophrenia, for example, we know that schizophrenia has a biological, a functional, and a neurochemical root. And yet, as this listener pointed out, we cannot use the brain as a diagnostic tool.
That's right.
Or an assessment of the brain as a diagnostic tool.
Yeah, the way the brain works is that there's a structure to it, and then there is a functional process we call physiology. There's electricity moves through the brain. Right. There's a functional process.
Yeah, and anatomy and physiology. Anatomy is the structure. Right. Physiology is the way that it works.
And because the brain uses electricity, there's an electrical component to it, okay? And so you might have an electrical problem. That would be something like epilepsy.
Right.
You could have a structural problem, a tumor, the presence of something that shouldn't be there, or the absence of something that should be there. So it might be or maybe it's a different size. There are some things that are structural problems because they're smaller than they should be.
Volume issues.
That's right. So you could have a structural problem. You could have a chemical problem. When we think of depression, we talk about a chemical imbalance. We frequently refer to it as a chemical imbalance. So you could have a chemical problem, a structural problem, or an electrical problem.
Right.
Okay. The question, though, is why can't we then use diagnostic tools, neuroimaging tools, to diagnose mental illness?
Right.
That was okay.
Yeah. All right. And the answer is very simple, but it's much more complex.
Right.
The simple answer is it's because all of our brains are different. They're grossly the same. We see a lot of consistency, but a lot of those consistencies are based upon aggregate data. So for
the
most
average
of us,
brain. We talk about the average brain.
Right.
Okay, that means you take 1,000 brains and look at them. They're all different.
Yeah.
But the average brain looks like this.
Yeah. Right. Most right-handed people, for example, have a left hemisphere that's slightly larger than the right hemisphere. Most of our language-based functions are housed in the left hemisphere, though there are some in the right hemisphere. More spatial orientation, those kinds of things are over on the right-hand side. And while those, as you said, are based upon average data, you could take any random person and all of that could be reversed. All of it could be completely different. There'll be some differences. I mean, there are areas that we know are attributed to particular skills. Right. But let's use, for example, if you had an injury to there's an area called Broca's area, and it's on the left-hand side of your brain. There's one on the right-hand side too, but we typically think about the one on the left-hand side.
We don't know what the one on the right is doing.
Right, because it's typically associated with language, and it's right back here. Just Broca's is here. There. Wernicke's is right behind it.
Right behind your ear.
Right. So they work together. Now, if you had an injury to Broca's area early in life,
right there,
what we might find is that you may still be able to talk, you may still be able to do these things, but you may not be able to do something else. And that's because even though Brokaw's area was the area that was damaged, another area of your brain, this is called neuroplasticity, another area of your brain may have picked up some of those skills, may have picked up some of those duties, but because they picked up those duties, they can't do the thing that they were originally designed for. Right. And so we will see deficits in Brokaw's area where we should say, wow, that should be a language-based issue, but they don't have a language-based issue. Instead, they have this issue, and that issue is associated with a different area of the brain. And so basically, maybe that was a much more convoluted example than I needed, but what happens is that even though our brains are grossly similar, the individual functions of different areas of our brain may vary slightly depending on our experiences and exposures and things like that.
Years ago, we did a study. I was at the University of Georgia, and we did a study with the University of Florida. And it was an MRI study. And
Georgia and Florida working together.
That's right.
Collaboratively.
Oddly. Well, they could in some ways. Oof. They couldn't in other ways. But yes, Georgia, Florida, it was a big collaborative grant between those two universities. And they hired a consultant from Germany who was he was trained first as a neurologist. And then he became a neurosurgeon.
Okay.
And he was shocked. He said, because we think of landmarks in the brain, certain features that we just associate with the brain. There are certain lines and structures and things. He said what surprised him is that when he would go in to do surgery, they all look different. Suddenly you think the line is supposed to be here, but it's someplace else.
Yeah.
So that re-educated him, because when you actually look at each brain, you see these individual differences. Yeah. The average brain looks like it does in the books, but each brain is a little bit different.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so you can't just take a person's MRI and say, oh, that's a this kind of brain, or that's a this kind of brain. Right. What you can do, what we're getting better at, is saying, okay, look, this person has a lot of the symptoms and traits consistent with schizophrenia.
Right.
Then you can go in and look at it, and it's, I wouldn't say confirmatory, but it's added support to diagnoses. We see and surprisingly, and I think a lot of people are really surprised by this, it's the same thing with Alzheimer's. We know that in the Alzheimer's brain, we get plaques and tangles, and it's the beta amyloid plaques and the tangles, the tau tangles, right? We have those in the brain, but we can't see any of those.
No.
Until either very, very late in the condition, or after the person has passed away, and we analyze the brain.
That's right.
Because it just doesn't show up on the neuroimaging.
As and another example, this same project, the Georgia Florida project that I was talking about, we learned that children who have, the way the brain is structured is that the front of the right hemisphere is a little bit larger than the front of the left hemisphere.
Right.
But in children and adults with ADHD, they're about the same size.
Right.
So you have symmetry where you should have asymmetry.
Right.
And you say, well, then if I do an MRI, I could find out every child who has ADHD. No.
Right.
Because some people have symmetrical brains but don't have ADHD.
Right.
Some people have ADHD because they have a chemical. Right. It's a chemical problem. They don't have enough dopamine.
Right.
So you can't just use neuroimaging as a clinical tool.
Right.
Right now we say it's a research tool. We use it to discover common features.
Right.
But we don't have the technology to use these things as diagnostic tools yet because of individual differences.
Right. Right. So just another quick example of, I think that a lot of times when we talk about the relationship between the brain and various mental health conditions, it's very much so simplified, oversimplified.
Yes, it is. Right now it is.
Because let's think about, really quick, just a very quick example, Tourette's Disorder. All right? Tourette's Disorder is theoretically a disorder of dopamine. And so the classic FDA approved treatment for schizophrenia, for Tourette's disorder, are antipsychotics.
Right.
Up until when I was doing my research with Tourette's disorder, which was in the late 90s and the first half of the quarter of the 2000s, the only two medications that were FDA approved for Tourette's disorder was Haldol and Orap, both of which are typical antipsychotics that, from what we understand, primarily decrease dopamine.
Right.
And it was helpful. Now, we think about that. Okay, so it's saying that we have, kids with, or individuals with Tourette's disorder may have too much of dopamine.
Right.
Well, another disorder that has too much dopamine is schizophrenia.
Right.
Now, Tourette's disorder and schizophrenia, I don't know of any necessary increased prevalence of comorbidity between schizophrenia and Tourette's disorder, despite the fact that supposedly, theoretically, both of them have sort of a hyper dopaminergic type of issue going on, too much dopamine. Making it even more complicated is the fact that 60% of people with Tourette's disorder also meet diagnostic criteria for ADHD, which is a disorder of too little dopamine, dopamine and norepinephrine. So here we have 60% of kids with a disorder that's characterized by too much dopamine, also having a diagnosis of a disorder that's characterized by having too little dopamine.
60%.
It's so much more complicated than just what we tend to hear about. We tend to see in news reports and all. So it's much more complicated.
Yeah, one of the things that really threw a lot of people is these colorful maps that we give the brain. And we say, well, but we can do a functional magnetic resonance imaging, and we can actually see the parts of the brain that light up when somebody's reading. Well, we don't know that here's what we know. We know that the parts of the brain that light up are the parts that are getting oxygen and glucose. We know that they're active. That those areas are active. We don't see the actual neurons reading. We just know that area of the brain becomes more active.
We don't know what they're doing.
No, we don't know what they're doing. We can't see the neurons in action. We have no idea what's going on.
Because remember, and this always blows my students' minds when we talk about this. Sometimes your neurons have to fire for nothing to happen.
That's right.
So think about that. So if you to not raise your hand, there's neurons that have to fire so that you don't raise your hand.
They have to inhibit the action, and they have to be active in order to inhibit.
Exactly. So for you to focus, say you're listening to this podcast, and you want to focus on this podcast, there are neurons that are firing so that you pay attention. But there's also neurons firing that you're not distracted by something else. So you have neurons firing to attend to this audio or video, and then you have other neurons that are firing that's saying, ignore that other audio and video.
Which means that the neurons that are firing to inhibit are also lighting up.
So they're both lighting up at the same time.
They're active. They're electrically active, but they're not causing anything to occur.
They're inhibiting something.
But if you look at the brain, you think, oh, this is the part of the brain. No, that may be the part of the brain that's inhibiting the action so that you can perform something else. So it's more complicated than these colorful maps initially indicate. And most neurologists say that. Most neuroimaging specialists say that. This is there are limitations to this technology.
But this is why we love the brain so much.
It's a complicated organ.
I think that we chose some of the most difficult things because we do, because of our neuropsychological work, we think about and talk about this stuff all the time, and working with kids a lot. That's challenging for many of the same reasons, and many of the, we just don't know.
That's right. We know what areas of the brain are active. We're not sure exactly what they're doing.
Okay?
So we don't study neurons. We study brain activity measured by oxygen and glucose metabolism.
The best that we can do is predict that if there's damage in a particular area, if it's done after adolescence, then you can pretty consistently say, okay, well, if you have damage to that area of the brain, this is likely to be what happens. And you can predict that with a little bit more confidence. But as far as it relates to mental health conditions, at best, it's confirmatory or supportive. But we're far from... And again, the reality now, too, is that because there's a lot of talk about genetics, one day we'll be able to do a genetic profile and we'll identify, the gene for ADHD. I don't think that's going to happen. No. There are way too many reasons why we may manifest ADHD symptoms. The same thing with autism and everything else. There are just far too many reasons, possible roots for that.
Because it could be structural, could be electrical, could be physiological.
And for all of those, there may be 3 or 4 different genes that are implicated. And so to have the number and specificity of patients to be able to make some of those claims, to then be able to research to what to do about it, it's just not very likely to happen.
Right. And earlier in this podcast, we talked about dopamine. But it's not a single system. There are 5 dopamine systems in your brain, and each plays a different role and function. So it's not just dopamine; it's which dopamine system. And there are dopamine receptors that activate it, and there are dopamine receptors that shut it down. So it's a much more complicated picture than we've been led to believe.
So.
But great question.
It is, and hopefully that's helpful for you, because it is a good question, and it is a complicated question, and a valid question. Why can't we? It does.
And typically, if you don't really want to find something on these neuroimaging studies, it's better if you don't find anything, because if you can find it,
if you find the right stuff. Because if you're looking for the right stuff and you can't find that, that's a different problem.
Right. But if you're, it's better not to find anything.
That's why I've never had an MRI.
You haven't?
Not of my brain. I had, no. I had one of my sinuses one time.
Oh, that's right,
because I broke my face one time.
Broke your nose.
Well, among other things.
Yeah.
That was great. That was a fun time.
But they didn't do your brain. They just
it was just the
face.
front there. Yeah.
Okay.
So. All right.
We always enjoy talking.
I don't know why we were talking about that.
Well, because you didn't have an MRI yet.
Oh, that's right.
Because you probably haven't had a lot of things that you'll be getting soon.
Yeah.
Because of
age?
Rapid aging.
I'm not looking forward to that.
Okay.
So, but
topic for another day.
That's it for today, because we're not going to go into that conversation here.
Right.
But we will be back for another episode. So we hope that you return. Make sure you follow us on all the different ways that you can follow us, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or Twitter or iTunes or Google Play Music or whatever the case may be. We really appreciate you following us. Please make sure that you write a review or rate us on iTunes. And if you follow us on and subscribe to our YouTube channel, make sure that you share it with your friends. We do have a lot more that we're planning in the coming months on our YouTube channels. So make sure you check those out.
Right.
So until next time, I'm Dr. Bernie.
I'm Dr. Richard.
Stay happy, stay healthy, forget to be afraid.